these things we're working on, percolations and mass transport properties. And so she's going to tell us some of her thesis work, and it also will be a good opportunity for her to interact with many people. She's relatively new, just joined us in September or October, and this will give us some conversation point, and it's all yours.
Great, thank you for the introduction, Faye. As Faye mentioned, I was a summer scholar in 2010. If you don't recognize me, perhaps you recognize one of the faces on the slide behind me, or one of the names. I'd first like to acknowledge my advisor at the time, Steve Gramsch, and my pseudo-advisor, Atsushi Kiyono. Without them, I don't think I would have gone on to graduate school. They were the two people that really introduced me to research and how special Carnegie is as a place to do research. And they spend, along with other scientists, a lot of time investing in the undergraduates that summer. And it was their mentorship that summer and through, so far, my entire career as a scientist that I think has helped me get back to this point. So I wanted to say thank you to them, as well as thank you to the other staff scientists. That this largely scales with SiO2 or silica content. So for example, I have a low silica magma, basalt at Kilauea volcano in Hawaii, and most of us know that these lavas just ooze out of the volcano. They're fun to look at, they're fun to poke, but it doesn't exactly render any news coverage for a day-to-day eruption. But this isn't always how the volcano erupts. For example, in 1924, there was a phreatomagmatic eruption where the magma interacted with some groundwater and produced this higher intensity explosive eruption, which produced an ash cloud, a steam and ash cloud that went about 20,000 feet into the air. On the other end of this silica high intensity spectrum would be a volcano like Mount St. Helens, or magmas such as dacite or rhyolites. And I don't think I would even have to tell you the volcano that I have pictured here, but this you can learn more about how eruption styles can shift. Now, in terms of magma's breaking rules, mafic volcanoes could probably win an award. They show a very large range of eruption styles, from low-intensity Strombolian and Hawaiian eruption styles, which are very beautiful, are for the most part easily accessible, so tourists like to go to them, and also scientists, and therefore they're relatively well studied. Mafic volcanoes also display higher intensity eruption styles, such as subplinian and plinian eruptions, which are very high intensity and have been recorded in eruptive units at Etna volcano in Italy, and as well as Tarawera through the conduit wall rocks. There's also viscous shearing of the magma along the conduit wall and permeability development of the magma itself. And it's this last mechanism that I'm going to be talking about today. So how does permeability occur in a magma? Most of us think of permeability in association with maybe sedimentary rocks, where you have fluid flow through some sedimentary grains, or maybe deeper in the earth where there's melt moving along grain boundaries. In magma, it's sort of the inverse, in that once a certain volume percent of bubbles form in the magma, they begin to interact with each other. And they do this through coalescence, where an inner melt film begins to drain away from two coalescing bubbles and eventually ruptures. And this forms little apertures between the bubbles. If enough of these apertures form, it was largely thought that this was probably controlled through melt viscosity. And now, this isn't a bad assumption at all, in that melt viscosity affects a lot of bubble magma relations in the conduit. So viscosity is the resistance to flow, and it's largely impacted by silica content, along with the temperature of the magma and an aperture to form to connect two bubbles. And in a higher silica magma, it's going to require more time for this melt to drain from in between these bubbles. And again, once this aperture forms, it'll take longer for the aperture to expand in a higher viscosity magma. So this is really important in terms of gas migration, because these little apertures are what's sort of what control gas movement through the permeable pathways. And they're mostly crystallizing due to volatile exsolution from the magma and the stabilization of more anhydrous phases. Not to mention the low viscosity of the mafic magmas allow crystal, essentially nutrients, to diffuse through the melt and nucleate crystals fairly readily. So my question was, can we sort of tease out whether melt viscosity or crystals are causing these two trends in permeability development, and what might that mean for magma permeability and eruption style? So I turned to experimental petrology to first do a series to look at how melt viscosity alone affects the percolation threshold, and then a second series to look at how crystals can influence permeability development. To do this, I started with 4 different compositions. 2 were basaltic andesites from Akmak and Westall volcano in the Aleutians. Also a phonolite from Mount Vesuvius in Italy, and a rhyodacite also from the Aleutian permeability analysis. The capsule was then put into a pressure vessel. It's actually sitting down at the bottom of this kind of T. At the top of the pressure vessel is a water-cooled region where the pressure line connects into. And the whole assembly is then lowered into a vertical furnace where it's heated and pressurized and left for an initial holding time, and then decompressed. And I used a few different decompression rates to also look at whether decompression rate might affect the percolation threshold as well. Now, it's this water-cooled jacket that you can kind of see poking out of the furnace here that's kind of the novelty of this experimental setup. And that's because looking at low viscosity melts, we want to try and freeze kinetic processes as soon as possible. So we need to quench the samples very quickly. And this method of pulling the experiment out and inverting it drops the sample from in the bottom of the pressure vessel into the water-cooled region. And that allows us to cool our sample to the glass transition between about 2 and 6 seconds. Permeability measurement. So once the epoxy is allowed to cure overnight, the sample is then cut perpendicular to its longest axis and ground so that we expose a cross section. And this is kind of an aerial view of one of the experiments. We then measure permeability by sandwiching this little experiment into a sample holder. This entire setup we built at UAF to measure these small experimental samples. Conventional permeameters typically can't measure permeability on these small samples. So we can measure experimental samples on this permeameter, as well as natural bigger samples. So what we do is we force compressed air through the sample and measure the pressure differential upstream and downstream of the sample over a range of gas flow rates, and we use that data to then calculate permeability using a modified version of Darcy's law. So we're first going to look at my data in relation to this cartoon volcanic conduit. And the y-axis is going to be vesicularity, or increasing vesicularity. And these are my data. The x-axis is permeability. And as you can see, as the experiments increase in vesicularity, they become permeable around 60 volume percent, extending up to about 80 volume percent. And this goes for the rhyolite, rhyodacite, and phonolite samples. This was very exciting because in nature we see percolation thresholds of 60 volume percent or greater. So our experiments seem to diameter, and there are these blue circles between 40 and about 60 volume percent. So we were very curious as to why we weren't seeing permeable samples. And if these are some photos of the experiments themselves, binary images, so the white part is glass and the black part are the voids. And if you follow the green arrows, these are decreasing in the final quench pressure. We can see that the samples do vesiculate, the vesicles do expand, and they even show some coalescence features. So why aren't they permeable? Another thing we noticed with these samples is that at lower quench pressures, the vesicularities we measured were lower than what we would expect for equilibrium vesicularities. And there's a few reasons that can cause this. I realize this is a fairly busy graph, but I'm going to just ask you to pay attention to the lower half of this graph. And just pay attention to this quench timescale line, horizontal line, and this, relaxation line. The quench timescale line, that's the 2 to 6 seconds I mentioned before that it takes for us to cool our samples. The relaxation timescale that increases with increasing viscosity, the relaxation timescale is the amount of time it takes for a bubble, in that what we think is happening is that these samples are essentially foaming up, developing permeability, and then that causes a sample to decrease in internal bubble pressure, which causes the bubbles to shrink. And this could result in why we're seeing lower vesicularities for a given quench pressure. And then the relaxation of the bubbles could reseal some of these permeable pathways that initially we think were in the magma, along with the bubble shrinkage due to internal pressure loss. So using our highest vesicularity measured as a lower bounds for the percolation threshold, we predict that the basaltic andesite melts have a percolation threshold higher than 63 volume percent. And this agrees with another study. You can see there's a huge change in bubble morphology, which means a change in the percolating pathway geometry, which will undoubtedly affect permeability development. Here are some segmented images where the different gray values represent the glass, which is a lighter gray, the darker gray, and I don't know if you can see the white specks in here, are all crystals that are forming in the experiments. And we see a wide range of crystal sizes and shape in all the experiments, and no particular change in shape between the different decompression rates. What was super exciting was that these samples were actually permeable, and we see that they become permeable around 50 volume percent. Before I get ahead of myself, the gray triangles are the silicic experiments from the previous study, and the red symbols are impermeable basaltic andesite experiments, and the blue are permeable. And along with this, we saw two different, also see this in nature, in that silicic pyroclasts tend to experience a sharp increase in permeability at the percolation threshold, and in mafic pyroclasts, we see this gradual trend in permeability vesicularity relationship. And this straight up and down line right here is the analog study that I referred to earlier. It's the crystal freeze study that suggests mafic magma should have high percolation thresholds. Furthermore, I found that there appears to be a crystal threshold for permeability development. So looking at my samples, this is crystallinity, or volume percent crystals on the x-axis and permeability on the y. The samples do not develop permeability unless there's about 20 volume percent crystals in the magma, and which is what has a crystallinity of about 16 volume percent. And the one on the right, 25 volume percent. So they're on either side of our crystal threshold. The colors within the bubbles themselves are showing bubble connectivity. And on the left-hand side, we see many colors, which means these are all isolated bubbles. And on the right-hand side, very few colors are shown because there's widespread connectivity through these samples. And as you can see, very different bubble shapes as well. And I think what's happening, and best illustrated by this figure down here, is that the crystals are causing the bubbles to deform. And essentially, as the bubbles are expanding, the crystals, some of which I've highlighted in pink, are sort of acting as guardrails as the bubbles expand. And so, as you can see, this bubble ends up kind of expanding vertically through this part of the sample, and then expanding a little bit more uniformly where there's no crystals. And crystals, or a lot of particles within it, and the particles can essentially jam and transmit stress through their particle networks, sort of locking the magma. So there are some analog studies looking at random loose packing and the development of yield strength in analog materials as well as experimental work, and those are denoted by these orange lines, the analog experiments, and then there's light blue boxes here where people have looked at natural lava flows and studied the development of yield strength. And our data fit well with this lower threshold for rectangular prisms. The development of the onset of random loose packing is really affected by the aspect ratio of the particles within the system. And typically, the higher the aspect ratio of the particles, the lower the threshold. We think the percolation threshold will not occur until very high vesicularities. Now, magmas with 20 volume percent crystals, or slightly higher, this will cause deformation of the bubbles and therefore lower percolation threshold, maybe around 40 to 50 volume percent. And this change in the percolation threshold is due to a rheological shift in the magma, where the crystals are forming a loosely touching network. So in terms of degassing regimes within the magma itself, low crystal content magmas really need to foam up to high vesicularities in order to become permeable. At this point in a magma's evolution, it's going to be fairly shallow in the conduit, which means not a lot of time for it to degas, even if it does achieve permeability, which could result in a more explosive eruption. With the addition of 20 volume percent crystals, there's bubble deformation, formation